They said the swamp was cursed, that once you entered, it remembered you forever. No one really believed it. Not until the night 17-year-old Lily Harrow vanished without a trace. The legend had always been something people whispered about after too many drinks at the local bar, or when fog crept over the marshes thick enough to make headlights useless. But on that hot July night, when the laughter of high school kids echoed near the water, and the cicadas screamed louder than the music, the story stopped being a tale. It became real. Lily wasn't the kind of girl who disappeared. She was bright, stubborn, with long chestnut hair that caught the wind when she ran track at school. Everyone in Willow Bend knew her, or at least thought they did. That night she had gone to the summer bonfire near Cypress Creek, the same tradition that marked the end of every school year. She'd fought with her mother before leaving home, a silly argument about curfews, about growing up too fast, but she'd promised she'd be back before midnight. It was the last promise she ever made. The bonfire burned bright, reflecting off the swamp water and the faces of teenagers who believed the world was still safe. Music played from a Bluetooth speaker, and someone passed around cheap beer. Lily danced barefoot in the grass, her laughter catching in the night air like sparks. Her best friend Sarah said she looked happy, almost too happy. Around 11, Lily received a text message. No one knew from whom. She checked her phone, frowned, and walked away from the crowd toward the edge of the creek. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, when Lily's bed was still empty, her mother called the police. At first, no one panicked. Teenagers ran away all the time, especially after arguments. Sheriff Dalton tried to reassure her mother, promising they'd find Lily within a day. But by the afternoon, when they found her phone half submerged in mud less than a mile from the bonfire site, the mood shifted. The phone had been recording a video. The footage was shaky, unfocused, and almost black. But the sounds were unmistakable. Heavy breathing, footsteps squelching in the mud, and a single terrified scream that echoed into silence. By evening, a search party had formed. Deputies, volunteers, and dogs moved through the swamp with flashlights that barely cut through the mist. The air was thick and alive, buzzing with mosquitoes and fear. Sheriff Dalton led the search himself. He had seen tragedies before, missing hikers, drownings, the occasional accident. But this was different. There was something wrong about the silence between the trees, as if the swamp itself was listening. They found Lily's shoe first, tangled in a patch of reeds. It was torn, covered in dark sludge. A few feet away, they discovered drag marks in the mud, leading deeper into the water. Dalton crouched, tracing the marks with his gloved hand. "This wasn't an animal," he said quietly. "Someone pulled her in." The words hung in the air like a curse. As night fell, the swamp seemed to close in on them. Flashlights flickered, radios crackled, and one of the deputies swore he heard whispering. But it was only the wind, or maybe the swamp playing tricks on them. By midnight, they called off the search. The volunteers were exhausted, and the dogs refused to go any further. Sheriff Dalton stayed behind a moment longer, standing knee-deep in the water, staring at the reflection of the moon rippling across the dark surface. He didn't believe in curses, but that night, something in his gut told him the swamp wasn't just hiding a body, it was keeping a secret. By the next morning, news of Lily's disappearance spread across town. Reporters arrived. Camera crews parked near the sheriff's office, and social media lit up with theories. Some said she'd been kidnapped by a drifter. Others whispered that she'd fallen victim to the swamp curse that haunted the Harrow family for generations. There had been stories: an uncle who went missing decades ago, a cousin who drowned mysteriously during a hurricane. People started connecting dots that maybe weren't there. Lily's mother refused to leave her house. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road, waiting for a car that would never come. Sarah came by with a blanket and a photo of Lily taken the night she vanished. She was fine, Sarah kept repeating. She was laughing. She didn't seem scared. But the longer she talked, the more her voice trembled. She remembered the text, the way Lily's expression changed just before she walked away. When the sheriff asked about it, she admitted she hadn't seen the number. The phone was locked, and when the forensic team tried to retrieve the last messages, the data was corrupted. Damaged by water, impossible to recover. Sheriff Dalton called for backup from the state police. Helicopters swept over the swamp. Search teams expanded their radius, and divers were sent into the black waters. Every day brought more frustration. The swamp wasn't just a landscape, it was a labyrinth. Water shifted, currents moved debris, and thick vegetation swallowed everything whole. Even bodies, if left too long, became part of it. The locals began avoiding Cypress Creek altogether. Businesses near the edge of the swamp lost customers, and fishermen swore they saw something pale floating beneath the surface at night. One man claimed he heard Lily's voice calling his name while he was out on his boat, soft and distant like wind through the cattails. No one believed him, but no one laughed either. Dalton spent nights reviewing the video from Lily's phone, playing it over and over until the sounds haunted his sleep. The scream wasn't long, just a single burst of terror, followed by splashing and silence. But he began to notice something new each time. In one frame there was a faint shadow, a figure moving toward her just before the camera hit the water. It was too dark to identify, but the outline looked human. Male. The sheriff sent the footage to the lab for enhancement, but even technology couldn't pierce the darkness of the swamp. He knew they were running out of time. The media started calling it the girl in the swamp case. The name stuck, and soon the whole country knew about Willow Bend. But the attention didn't help. It only made the locals angry and the Harrow family more broken. One evening a storm rolled in, painting the sky purple and gray. Dalton stood on the edge of Cypress Creek, rain soaking his hat as lightning flashed over the water. The swamp looked endless, ancient, like it had seen 1,000 tragedies before this one. He tried to imagine what had happened that night. Lily walking away from the bonfire, her phone in hand, headlights in the distance, someone calling her name. He imagined her running, slipping, screaming, and then nothing. The silence after was worse than any sound. That night, as the wind howled through the cypress trees, Dalton made himself a promise. He wouldn't let this case go cold. Not this one. Not the girl who had smiled at him every morning at the diner when she came in for coffee before school. She wasn't just another missing person. She was a reminder that evil didn't always wear a mask. It sometimes lived quietly next door, waiting for the right moment. And somewhere in the swamp, beneath the dark water and the choking vines, the truth waited. It wasn't done with them yet. It was only beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Lily Harrow consumed the entire town of Willow Bend. The posters with her smiling face hung on every lamppost, every storefront, and every bulletin board in the county. Missing was printed in bold red letters above her picture, and below it was her mother's trembling plea for anyone with information to come forward. At first, the townspeople were hopeful. They brought food to search teams, shared stories of sightings that always turned out to be nothing, and prayed at the small church near the creek. But hope has a way of fading when the days start blending together, and there's still no sign of the missing. By the second week, the swamp had started to reclaim its silence. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though the place itself resented being disturbed. The volunteers who once came in groups now came fewer and fewer. They said the swamp didn't want to give her back. One by one, they started believing the stories. About the old curse, about the spirits that lived beneath the mud. About how the swamp took what it wanted and never let go. Even the dogs began to refuse to enter certain areas. They would whine and pull back, their noses twitching at something their handlers couldn't see. A local psychic offered to help, insisting she could feel Lily's energy calling from beyond the veil of water. But Sheriff Dalton turned her away. He didn't believe in that kind of thing. Monsters, he always said, were made of flesh and blood, not mist and myth. But in the quiet moments when he was alone and the sound of frogs and insects filled the air like a song, even he started to wonder. The investigation began to take on a darker tone. Every friend, every teacher, every neighbor was questioned. Some broke down in tears. Others grew defensive. Secrets started spilling out. Lily had been seeing someone. People whispered, someone older. Someone she'd met online, but when detectives searched her social media, her messages had been wiped clean days before she vanished. Someone had erased them. That discovery changed everything. It wasn't a runaway case anymore. It was an abduction. Sheriff Dalton ordered a deeper dive into the surveillance cameras around the swamp road, hoping for anything that could show where Lily went after she left the bonfire. Most cameras were too far or too old, their recordings corrupted by humidity and neglect. But then a technician found a traffic camera 2 miles away that had captured something. It was around 11:47 p.m., the night of her disappearance. The footage showed Lily's car slowing down, the headlights flickering through the mist. Then from the shadows a man appeared. He walked toward her window, his face hidden by a hood. The footage was grainy, the light uneven, but something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, with a slight limp, made Dalton's stomach twist. The next frame cut to black. The sheriff watched it over and over, trying to ignore the pounding in his chest. That limp, that dragging gait, he'd seen it before. Only one man in Willow Bend moved like that, Travis Cole. Travis was a local handyman known for odd jobs and bad habits. He lived alone on the outskirts of town in a rusting trailer surrounded by overgrown weeds. He was quiet, kept to himself, and always seemed to appear where he wasn't wanted. 2 years earlier, he had worked at Willow Bend High as a maintenance worker, but his contract was cut short after complaints were filed about him following some of the girls home, Lily among them. There had been no proof of anything criminal, so he walked free. But Dalton never forgot his eyes. Cold, distant, the kind of eyes that watched too long. When the sheriff arrived at Travis's property with 2 deputies, the place smelled of rot and gasoline. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, its chain rattling. Travis stepped out onto his porch, his limp more pronounced than ever. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice rough, his clothes stained with oil. Dalton didn't answer right away. He was looking past him, toward the trailer windows covered with newspaper, blocking out all light. "Lily Harrow," Dalton said finally. "We need to ask you a few questions." Travis smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That girl everyone's been crying about? Haven't seen her. Don't know her." But when deputies searched his home, the truth spilled out like poison. Inside the trailer, the smell of decay was stronger. The wallpaper peeled from the walls, and old newspapers were stacked in piles that reached the ceiling. But what caught their attention was the small room in the back. On the walls were dozens of photographs of Lily. Some from her social media, others clearly taken without her knowing. There were newspaper clippings about her track meets, a bracelet she'd lost months before, and a map of the swamp with several red X's marked in different locations. Travis was handcuffed on the spot. He shouted that it was all a setup, that someone was trying to ruin him, but the evidence was undeniable. His fingerprints were found on Lily's phone, which had been recovered from the swamp. When questioned, he claimed he had found the phone on the road and picked it up out of curiosity, but no one believed him. Despite the mounting evidence, there was one critical problem. There was no body, no trace of Lily beyond her belongings. The shoe, the phone, and those haunting marks in the mud. The state prosecutor hesitated to file murder charges without a body, fearing the case would collapse in court. Travis was charged with kidnapping, held without bail, but the town was divided. Some people were convinced he was guilty. Others said it was too convenient, that the sheriff needed someone to blame. Weeks turned into months and still no body was found. The swamp swallowed everything. Even the divers, trained and fearless, admitted defeat. They said it was like the ground itself moved, closing in around them, reshaping itself every time they tried to map it. The case drew national attention. News vans lined the streets, broadcasting live from the heart of Willow Bend. The once quiet town became a place of curiosity, and tourists began to visit Cypress Creek, standing behind police tape as if watching a show. They called it The Girl in the Swamp, a name that sounded like something out of a horror story. Lily's mother couldn't bear the attention. She stopped speaking to reporters and eventually left town, unable to pass by the creek without breaking down. Her house remained empty, the front porch light forever left on. Sarah, her best friend, visited often, sitting on the porch steps as if expecting Lily to walk up the road any moment. But she never did. For Sheriff Dalton, the case became an obsession. He couldn't shake it. Not the scream on the phone recording, not the image of her shoe tangled in the reeds, not the sight of Travis Cole's cold, expressionless face in the interrogation room. Sometimes at night he dreamed of walking through the swamp again, only this time the mud was filled with faces, pale, wide-eyed, reaching for him. When he woke, he could still smell the rot of cypress water and hear Lily's faint cry echoing somewhere just out of reach. Then came the whispers. Locals claimed they'd seen something in the swamp, something moving just beneath the surface. A fisherman reported hearing a voice call his name one evening, soft and distant, followed by ripples spreading across the still water. Teenagers dared each other to go to the creek after midnight, but none lasted long. They said the air grew too heavy, too cold, as if the swamp was breathing. Dalton didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in signs, and something told him that the swamp wasn't done with them yet. There was a truth buried out there, hidden beneath the roots and water. It was waiting to be found. He stood one evening on the bank of Cypress Creek as the sun went down, the water turning the color of blood under the fading light. The silence pressed against his ears until all he could hear was the faint hum of insects and his own heartbeat. Somewhere out there, beneath that endless stretch of black water, was Lily Harrow's final story. And whether it was the work of man or the curse of the swamp, Sheriff Dalton knew he would find it. Because even if the swamp remembered everyone who entered, it also remembered what it had taken, and one day it always gave something back. The day of Travis Cole's arrest should have brought relief to Willow Bend, but it didn't. Instead, the town seemed to grow colder, quieter, as though everyone sensed that something still wasn't right. Even with Travis behind bars, the air hung thick with unease. The newspapers ran headlines calling him a monster, but in the corner of every diner and bar someone would whisper, "If he did it, where's the body?" The question haunted everyone, especially Sheriff Dalton. Travis sat in a holding cell at the county jail, staring through the bars with that same blank expression he'd had the night of his arrest. He hardly spoke. When he did, his voice was calm, eerily calm, like a man who knew something everyone else didn't. Dalton spent hours questioning him, trying to break through the wall of silence. "You followed her," he said. "We have your fingerprints, your photos, your map. You took her, Travis. Just tell me where she is." But Travis only smiled faintly, his eyes unfocused. "You don't understand, Sheriff," he said one night, leaning forward. "She's not gone. She's still there." That line made Dalton's skin crawl. He wanted to slam his fist on the table, to scream that there was no there left to find. But something about Travis's tone, calm, certain, made him hesitate. What did he mean? The prosecution built their case, but without a body, it was weak. Evidence could prove Travis had stalked Lily. It could prove he'd been near her car. But it couldn't prove what he'd done to her. The defense played that advantage hard. They painted him as a misunderstood man, a loner who had become an easy target. They said the town had turned on him because he didn't fit in, because people wanted a villain. The trial dragged on, and with each day, Dalton could feel the case slipping through his fingers. Lily's mother attended every session, clutching her daughter's bracelet in her hands, her eyes hollow. The courtroom smelled faintly of damp paper and stale coffee, and every time Travis's lawyer spoke, Dalton could feel the frustration boil inside him. He had seen monsters before, men who hid behind charm, who lied with perfect smiles, but none unnerved him like Travis Cole. The jury deliberated for 2 days before delivering their verdict. Guilty of kidnapping, not guilty of murder. There wasn't enough evidence to prove death beyond a reasonable doubt. Travis was sentenced to 25 years, but Dalton didn't feel victory. Without a body, there was no closure. Without the truth, the case felt unfinished, like a wound that refused to heal. Months turned into years. The headlines faded, the reporters left, and Willowbend slowly went back to pretending everything was normal. But the swamp never forgot. Every spring, when the water rose and flooded the edge of Cypress Creek, something strange would happen. Items belonging to Lily would surface. First, her earring, then a torn piece of fabric that matched the shirt she wore the night she vanished. Once a fisherman found her locket tangled in his net. Each time the sheriff sent them to the lab hoping for a lead. Each time the results came back the same, degraded, waterlogged, inconclusive. Dalton couldn't let it go. He kept Lily's file on his desk. The photos spread out like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Her smile in those pictures was so alive, so full of light. It made the whole case feel heavier. He reread every report, replayed every interview, revisited every inch of the swamp. Some nights he sat in his truck near the creek, the headlights reflecting off the water, and just listened. Sometimes he thought he heard her voice in the wind, faint and trembling. He told himself it was the frogs, the crickets, the hum of the night. But deep down he wasn't so sure. Then one evening, 5 years after Lily's disappearance, something happened that would pull the town back into its nightmare. It was mid-June when a storm rolled in from the coast. The kind that turned the sky black and made the air taste of metal. A fisherman named Earl Booker came running into the sheriff's office, soaked to the bone and shaking so badly he could barely speak. "It's her," he stammered. "I found her car." Dalton froze. "Where?" Earl pointed toward the window, his hand trembling. "Out near the bend where the trees meet the old dock. The storm tore up half the roots there. I saw metal under the water. It's her car, Sheriff, I swear it." Dalton didn't waste a second. Within the hour, deputies, divers, and rescue teams were heading toward Cypress Creek. The rain poured in sheets, blurring everything into gray. The swamp water rose high and the cypress roots jutted out like skeletal fingers. Flashlights cut through the darkness as the divers slipped into the murky water. Dalton stood on the edge, heart pounding, watching as bubbles surfaced. Minutes felt like hours. Then one of the divers waved his arm, signaling. They had found it. The car was half buried in the mud, its frame rusted but recognizable. The license plate, though corroded, matched Lily's. The divers worked carefully, attaching cables to pull it out. As the crane lifted the vehicle from the depths, mud and water poured out like blood from an open wound. The smell of rot filled the air and everyone fell silent. Inside, through the cracked windshield, a shape was visible, fragile, unmoving. It was Lily. Her skeletal remains sat in the driver's seat, her head tilted slightly as though she were still looking toward the swamp. Around her neck hung a small heart-shaped necklace, tarnished but intact. Dalton felt the world tilt beneath him. After all these years, the swamp had finally given her back. But there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. In the passenger seat was another body. It was barely identifiable. The bones tangled in the seatbelt, the jaw twisted open as if in a scream. When they lifted it out and ran the prints through the database, the results confirmed what Dalton had already begun to fear. The second body was Travis Cole. The news hit Willowbend like a thunderclap. For years, people had hated Travis, cursed his name, called him a murderer. Now it seemed the truth was far more complex and far more horrifying. If he was in the car with her, then everything they thought they knew about that night was wrong. Back at the station, the evidence team discovered a waterproof camera lodged under the seat. Somehow it had survived all those years submerged. The footage, once recovered, revealed the missing truth of Lily Harrow's final moments. The screen flickered with static before showing Lily's terrified face as she drove down the swamp road. The camera was mounted on the dashboard, her voice trembling as she whispered to herself, "He's following me. He's behind me." The headlights in her rear-view mirror grew closer. She screamed, the car swerved, the camera shaking violently. Then a flash of Travis's face as he ran toward her car, not with anger but panic. He tried to pull her from the vehicle as it sank. His hands beat against the window, his mouth forming words no one could hear. Then the water rose, dark and merciless, swallowing them both. The final frame showed Lily reaching toward him, their hands inches apart before everything went black. Dalton watched the footage alone in his office, his throat tight. All those years, he had been wrong. Travis hadn't killed her. He had chased her, terrified, maybe even trying to save her after the crash. The swamp had taken them both, binding them in silence. When Dalton finally closed the file that night, he walked outside into the humid air. The town was quiet, the streets slick with rain. He made his way to Cypress Creek one last time, standing by the water's edge. The swamp rippled gently beneath the moonlight, peaceful now, as if its hunger had been sated. He whispered her name, Lily, and for the first time he didn't hear the echo of pain. Instead, there was stillness, a kind of calm he hadn't felt in years. He looked down, half expecting to see her reflection staring back, but the surface only showed his own tired face. The case was over. The truth was finally out. But the swamp, he knew, would never forget. It had kept their secret all this time, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. As Dalton turned to leave, a soft breeze moved through the cypress trees, carrying with it the faintest sound. A whisper, delicate as the ripple of water. It sounded like her voice saying, "Thank you." He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The swamp had spoken, and the girl who haunted Florida forever could finally rest. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days after they pulled Lily Harrow's car from the swamp. The sky remained gray, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. Sheriff Dalton barely slept. He sat at his desk, staring at the file that had haunted him for 5 long years. For the first time since that night, the words "case closed" could be written across the top, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Closure didn't come easy when ghosts still whispered in your ear. The town of Willow Bend had gone eerily silent. Reporters flooded in again, cameras flashing, headlines screaming about the girl in the swamp, and the shocking twist that the man accused of killing her had died beside her. Some called it tragic, others poetic justice, but to Dalton it was neither. It was unfinished business. There were still questions that gnawed at him. Why was Travis chasing her that night? What had scared her so badly that she fled down that lonely road? The footage from the recovered camera had provided part of the truth, but it wasn't everything. The storm that night had made the road slick, visibility near zero. Lily's breathing had been fast, panicked. She kept glancing into the mirror, whispering, "He's coming." The headlights behind her weren't steady. They flickered, dimmed, then surged again, as if someone was struggling to keep control. Travis's face appeared for only a split second before the crash, but what the camera didn't explain was the sound that came just before the car went off the road. It was a voice, deep, distant, echoing through the trees. A voice that didn't belong to either of them. Dalton listened to that clip over and over, the words barely audible through the static, but it chilled him every time. "You shouldn't have come here." Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the swamp playing tricks again. But even after all these years, Dalton knew better than to dismiss the feeling that some places held memories like scars. Cypress Creek was one of them. It had seen too much death to ever be silent. The day after the car was recovered, a small ceremony was held for Lily. Her remains were laid to rest beside her father, who had passed when she was a child. The entire town showed up, umbrellas dotting the cemetery like black flowers. The rain came down in sheets, but no one moved. Sarah stood near the front, clutching a bouquet of lilies so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had never forgiven herself for letting Lily walk away from the bonfire that night. When the service ended, she lingered at the grave, whispering something no one could hear. Dalton stayed behind after everyone left. He stood by the headstone, water dripping from his hat, staring at the engraved words, "Beloved daughter, gone too soon." His voice was rough when he spoke. "I'm sorry, kid," he said softly. I should have found you sooner." The wind picked up then, brushing through the trees, and for a moment it sounded like laughter. Light, fleeting, almost familiar. He closed his eyes. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was her. A week later, the investigation into the recovered evidence was officially concluded. The forensics report confirmed that both Lily and Travis had died from drowning. The water had rushed in through the broken windshield too fast for them to escape. But the toxicology report revealed something unexpected. Both had traces of sedatives in their systems. Dalton froze when he read that line. It didn't make sense. If they'd both been drugged, who had drugged them? He reopened the case file. The prosecutor wasn't happy about it. Said it was a waste of time digging into what was already over. But Dalton couldn't let it go. He started tracing back every connection, every name that had appeared in Lily's life before she vanished. And that's when he noticed something strange. Her last call that night hadn't been to her mother or her friends. It had been to an unlisted number, one that didn't appear in any of her previous records. The number was deactivated a day after her disappearance. Dalton requested the old phone logs and managed to trace the number to an address, an abandoned property just outside of town. The owner was listed as a shell company that no longer existed. But the lot had once belonged to the Harrow family decades ago, before it was sold off. It was near the edge of the swamp. He drove there alone that evening. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, the air thick with fog. The property was nothing more than a decaying cabin swallowed by vines. The wooden boards creaked beneath his boots as he stepped inside, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Dust hung in the air, glittering like ash. There was barely any furniture left, just a broken chair, a rotting table, and piles of old papers scattered across the floor. But near the fireplace, something caught his attention. A half-buried tin box. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Some were of Lily, taken from a distance, walking home from school, sitting at the diner, jogging by the track. But there were others too. Pictures of her mother. Pictures of Sheriff Dalton himself. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Whoever had been watching Lily had also been watching him. He turned one of the photos over, and on the back, written in smudged ink, were the words, "She knew too much." A sound echoed from outside, the crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. Dalton's flashlight flickered. He drew his gun and moved toward the doorway, but when he stepped outside, the fog was so thick he could barely see. "Who's there?" he called out. No response. The only sound was the slow drip of water from the trees. Then faintly a voice. It was a girl's voice whispering, "Don't trust him." The fog shifted, and for a split second Dalton saw something. A figure standing by the water's edge. It was small, frail, long hair hanging over its face. When he blinked, it was gone. The swamp rippled once, then went still. Dalton left the property that night with the photographs in his coat pocket, and a growing sense that the swamp still wasn't done telling its story. He turned the evidence over to the state, but they dismissed it as old paranoia, the work of someone obsessed with the case. Still, Dalton couldn't shake the feeling that Lily's death had been part of something larger, something that went beyond Travis Cole, beyond the curse, beyond the town itself. As summer turned to autumn, the swamp began to dry. The heat returned and the air filled again with the buzzing of cicadas. Tourists came to see the infamous site where Lily's car had been found, snapping photos by the water, smiling as if tragedy were a backdrop for entertainment. Dalton hated it. He spent most of his days sitting in his office, staring at the old case file, knowing that the answers were still out there somewhere, buried deeper than anyone wanted to dig. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the water red, Dalton took one last drive to Cypress Creek. The swamp was quiet now, calm, its surface smooth as glass. He walked down to the edge, the same place he'd stood all those years ago when the search began. The reflection of the trees shimmered across the water, their roots twisting like veins. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "You can rest now, Lily." A breeze stirred the reeds. The water rippled, and in that brief distortion he thought he saw her face, clear, smiling, peaceful. It lingered only for a moment before fading back into shadow. The air grew still again. Dalton turned to leave, the weight on his chest finally lifting. The swamp for the first time felt quiet, not ominous, not watching, just quiet. The kind of silence that meant it had finally let go of its secret. But as he reached his car, something made him stop. From the distance near the bend of the creek came a faint splash, followed by the soft echo of laughter. Young, light, unmistakably hers. He smiled faintly, tipping his hat toward the sound. "Good night, kid," he whispered. Then he got in his car and drove away as the last light of day vanished behind the cypress trees. The swamp returned to stillness, the surface calm and black under the moon. Somewhere beneath that dark water, memory slept, tragic, eternal, and untouched. And though Willow Bend would move on, though the headlines would fade and the cameras would leave, the people would always remember the story of the girl in the swamp. The girl who never truly left and the place that never let her go.